now. So Monique, tell us a little bit about what has been with all these COVID-19, restrictions and problems, and how you're going about it.
Well, I am somewhat strictly quarantined. My mom lives with me and she's in her 70s and she has health conditions. And so we have been pretty strictly quarantining, which I'm happy to say really hasn't limited a lot of the activities that I'm used to doing just because of Zoom. I have to give a shout out to Zoom. I don't know what we would have done. I know there are other platforms like Facebook and other platforms, but in my work and also in my personal life and also in my Bahai activities, Zoom has been awesome and a great tool to be able to continue to do my normal activities. So shout out to Zoom.
Indeed, indeed. Shout out to Zoom. So we want to introduce our speaker. And if you got an idea, Miss Monique Stevens is a local teacher and mother and daughter who has been involved for decades in activities promoting the principles of racial equality and the oneness of mankind. Monique speaks frequently at public meetings addressing these and other issues from her perspective as a member of the Baha'i faith. Most recently, Monique has been involved with other Baha'is in the creation of a local race unity task force for the purpose of developing more effective responses to what Shoghi Effendi, great-grandson of the founder of the Baha'i faith, termed our country's most challenging issue. Now, the topic this week, race unity, a prerequisite to American and global progress. Ms. Monique Stevens will discuss the Baha'i perspective on race unity as it relates to the oneness of humanity and the Baha'i goal of carrying forward an ever-advancing civilization. So, we are ready. We heard the topic. It's a pretty broad topic. So, if you could lead us from here, Monique, we'd really appreciate it.
Okay, I am happy to do that. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, John. And
A pleasure.
before I begin, I have to say that I am really humbled and hopeful about the level of interest and action that I have seen lately regarding the issue of race unity and ending racism. I can tell you that in my lifetime, I don't think I've experienced this level of interest and action surrounding this issue. I was born not kind of in the, I guess I'm dating myself, but let's just say I didn't witness the civil rights movement firsthand. Okay. So for me, this is really heartening and hopeful. And I really want to thank the Clearwater Baha'i Center also because you all have been at the forefront recently in just pushing out events regarding with respect to this issue, and thumbs up, and great job. I really appreciate what you guys do, and I appreciate you having me on today. I also would like to give a shameless plug to the Tampa community and our Tampa area race unity task force, and we do have a Facebook page as well, and perhaps I can type that later in the chat. And we do have events as well. We have an Elevated Conversations About Race event that we do and have been doing, and we have some book discussions and movie discussions surrounding these issues. So there is a lot going on. Good job, Clearwater and Tampa, and just the whole country and the whole world right now. So yay, right? Moving on to today's topic, which is race unity, a prerequisite to American and global progress. As you mentioned in the introduction, in December 1938, Shoghi Effendi, who was the great grandson of the founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, he wrote a book-length letter to the American believers. And when I say American, at that time, he was referring mostly to the Baha'is in the United States and Canada. We do have Baha'is now all over the Americas, but the letter was written to the Baha'is of the United States and Canada. And in that letter, Shoghi Effendi mentioned that racial prejudice was the most challenging issue that the Baha'is would face in their efforts to teach the Baha'i principles of unity, because of the history of the country and the circumstances that were existing in the country at the time. Now, just looking at this picture, you might, I kind of put this up because I think that when we talk about, you know, what the most challenging issue is for our country, some other challenges might come to your mind, such as the pandemic or the natural disasters that we're currently facing in an increasing number with increasing frequency, such as the fires in California, or, you know, hurricanes, flooding, weather events, homelessness, poverty, hunger, school shootings, and the increase in violence, all kinds of violence across the country, drug addiction, the opioid epidemic, problems with education, not just school shootings, but just the quality of education and equity in education, the ability of all children to get a good education. So there are many problems that we could look at and think about and say, well, these are very challenging problems as well. Why is it that, you know, Shoghi Effendi said race was the most challenging issue? And that was in 1938. So since then, we've made a lot of progress in the area of race. But even though that statement was made 80 years ago and we've had progress since then, I would say, I believe that it is true that racism continues to be our most challenging issue. And so I guess my job during this discussion would be to convince you why it is that I believe that, or to convince you to also see racism as, if not our biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges. But I do believe we could still say that it is the biggest challenge, and that resolving the issue of racism is a prerequisite to solving our other problems in this country as well as globally. So what do I mean by progress, first of all? So before we explore the idea that race unity is a prerequisite, it's really important to understand, because we all might have different ideas of what progress is. So I am going to come from a Baha'i perspective, which I happen to agree with, which is probably why I'm a Baha'i, on what we mean by progress. So if I could get a volunteer to read this quote by Baha'u'llah. And just unmute yourself if you are going to read the quote. Just remember to unmute yourself.
All men have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. The Almighty beareth me witness, to act like the beast of the field is unworthy of man. Those virtues that befit his dignity are forbearance, mercy, compassion, and loving kindness towards all the peoples and kindreds of the earth. Say, O friends, drink your fill from this crystal stream that floweth through the heavenly grace of him who is the Lord of names. Let others partake of its waters in my name, that the leaders of men in every land may fully recognize the purpose for which the eternal truth hath been revealed, and the reason for which they themselves have been created. Baha'u'llah Gleanings.
Okay, so that was that quote has a lot of punch. There is a lot of information, a lot of ideas. But the one that I'd like you to focus on is the phrase ever advancing civilization. So this calls to mind a civilization that gets progressively better over time And what we mean by better is mentioned in another part of this quote, where Baha'u'llah lists certain virtues. So if we look at those virtues, and I'm going to repeat some of them. One second. We have dignity and forbearance, mercy, compassion, loving kindness towards all the peoples and kindreds of the earth. And I'm sure that we can all think of many more virtues. So manifesting those virtues as human beings, both spiritually and materially, is what I would call, and what Baha'u'llah is referring to as, progress and an ever advancing civilization. So if we think about some of those problems that we mentioned earlier in the earlier slides, such as homelessness and, natural disasters that aren't dealt with effectively, and the pandemic and other problems and challenges, if we think of those virtues, I think we'd all agree that those aren't consistent with the execution of those virtues. So that is what we'll explore moving forward. So what is the origin of these virtues? I mean, we all can agree that we need more of them, and that if we had more of them, the world would definitely be a better place. So what is the origin of those moral virtues? And if someone could please read this quote from Abdul Baha, who is the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah.
As for the spiritual perfections, they are man's birthright and belong to him alone of all creation. Man is, in reality, a spiritual being, and only when he lives in the spirit, he is truly happy.
Okay, so these virtues that we often call moral virtues are in fact spiritual virtues given to us by God as a birthright. And we have the option of exercising those virtues because he also gave us free will, or we can ignore those virtues. We can ignore the development of our spiritual capacities. If man is a spiritual being and these virtues are necessary, then it would seem necessary also for us as human beings to nurture and foster those virtues in the same way that we nourish our physical bodies, that we would nourish our spiritual bodies as well by developing these virtues. And if we do that, or unless we do that, I'm not sure how we can expect to have any progress. So what is that relationship between spiritual, intellectual, and material progress? If I could get another volunteer to read this quote from Abdul Baha, and we can talk about that.
In man, there are two natures, his spiritual or higher nature and his material or lower nature. In one, he approaches God. In the other, he lives for the world alone. Signs of both these natures are to be found in men. In his material aspect, he expresses untruth, cruelty, and injustice. All these are the outcome of his lower nature. The attributes of his divine nature are shown forth in love, mercy, kindness, truth, and justice, one and all being expressions of his higher nature.
Thank you. Before I discuss this, I do want to remind you, if you have a question or a comment about what we're discussing as we move through the presentation, please go ahead and type that in the chat. And if it's urgent, we'll go ahead and address it immediately. And if it's something that's going to require more thought and discussion, then we'll leave it for the end of the presentation. So I feel like this quote kind of gives us an idea of the relationship between spiritual progress and material progress. It's an illustration of the primacy of the spiritual over the material. It's also an explanation of the origin of some of the personal and societal challenges that we mentioned earlier. That origin being man neglecting the cultivation of spiritual virtues, leading to a manifestation on the material plane of the lack of those virtues. In other words, a lot of people might think of it in terms of thoughts turning into action. So how our positive thoughts turn into positive actions, our negative thoughts also turn into negative actions, or just a lack of development of positive thoughts and actions can leave a state of material neglect where we're just not addressing certain material problems. So what about racism? Can we end racism? Actually, I'd like to stop here and just have everybody put in the chat your idea about that, or your answer to that question. Do you think that we can end racism ever? I'm really curious to see what people think about that. So I'll give everybody a chance to type their thoughts into the chat box.
So I see people writing in, absolutely.
Okay.
I think we can agree on that.
Be honest though. I want everybody to be honest.
I see yes, but it will take a long time. Definitely, with God's help. Another one, yes, of course. We have promise of the most great peace. And then only if we work together and work on our own spiritual growth. All of these are great points. Great points.
Okay. So I did ask the question in a certain way, and I just want to show how we can ask it in a different way. So if I could get someone to please read this quote.
The intellectual realities, such as all the qualities and admirable perfections of man, are purely good and exist. Evil is simply their non-existence. So ignorance is the want of knowledge. Error is the want of guidance. Forgetfulness is the want of memory. Stupidity is the want of good sense. All these things have no real existence. Some answered questions.
So Abdul-Baha talks about this a lot in terms of how we define things and how we think of spiritual reality. Viewed in this light, racism can be seen as a lack of unity, as opposed to something in and of itself. I think sometimes when we get pessimistic or we say that it's going to take a really long time to end racism, it's because we're thinking of racism as this concrete thing that we have to get rid of. And we can think of it like that because it's very concrete to people who suffer from it, right? But we can think of it in another way as well. We can think of racism as a lack of unity. So the thing that actually exists and is positive and has a real reality is unity. In the same way that love actually exists, whereas hatred is more a lack of love, right? Or if you are looking at it from a scientific perspective, we talk about heat and cold, but does cold really exist, or is it just the absence of heat? Does darkness exist, or is it just the absence of light? So does racism exist? Well, we know it manifests, it has a manifestation in the physical world. But what truly exists is love and unity. And when we have a lack of love and unity, then we have racism. And when we talk about solutions to ending racism, if we can focus on what building unity looks like, and actions and activities that we can do to build unity, then I think we can have a more hopeful and positive outlook on on whether or not we can end racism and whether we can do it right now. Because I think we can all agree that there are actions that we can all take right now to build unity. You may not feel powerful enough to end someone's racism, but there's never a time when you can't reach out and build unity. So I think if we think of it that way, we have a much more hopeful and positive and optimistic outlook. And that outlook actually coincides with spiritual principles. So what is the remedy? In addition to doing those positive activities. Okay, my slide is acting weird. Just a moment. I'm frozen. I'm not sure why. I'm going to stop share for just a moment because my slide froze and try to get it to unfreeze. Okay, let's try that again. Not sure why it froze. Didn't give me any kind of warning. So let's do that. There we go. So if I could get a person to please read that quote. A volunteer?
The all-knowing physician
I'll read it.
hath his finger on the pulse of mankind. He perceiveth the disease, and prescribeth in his unerring wisdom the remedy. Every age hath its own problem, and every soul its particular aspiration. The remedy the world needeth in its present day afflictions can never be the same as that which a subsequent age may require. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age ye live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements.
Thank you. This is actually one of my favorite quotes from the Bahai writings. It kind of encapsulates in a nutshell the idea of progressive revelation. And if you're familiar with the Baha'i faith, I know you already know what that means, or you may know what it means just from being familiar with religious studies in general. But Baha'u'llah taught that each of God's manifestations or prophets or messengers came with a mission, a particular mission and a particular guidance or that he needed or he was given in order to give to mankind based on what mankind's needs were at that time and in that place. And so you had, Moses, and you had Muhammad, and you had Buddha, and you had Krishna and Jesus and Baha'u'llah and the Bab, and they all had a particular mission and a particular message that they were supposed to deliver based on the needs of the society at that time. And prior to the revelation of Baha'u'llah, the world was not yet it wasn't a small united world, right? We didn't have the technology that we have now, which means that, if something was happening in Africa, people in China had no clue that that was happening, or if something was happening in India, people in the United States had no clue that that was happening. And so the idea that our problems were interconnected was not something that people could visualize as well as they can today, or even at all. So thinking about the world that we live in now and how interconnected it is, and how as soon as there's any kind of event or tragedy problem in another country, everybody all over the world instantly knows about it. That is something that is unique to our modern times. So if we look at this quote with Baha'u'llah talking about every age having its own problem and every soul its particular aspiration, and the remedy for the problems of a particular age being different from the remedies required in other ages. I'd like everybody to do another kind of activity for me. If you could type in the chat and tell me what you think the problem, if you could pick one word, one phrase to say what the problem of this modern age is, and go ahead and type that in the chat, because I'm sure we can think of all kinds of problems that we have. But what would be, if you had to sum it up in one word, what would you say that problem of our modern times is? And I can't see the chat, so I'll be interested to hear what, if John, if you could read it out.
Self, prejudice, disunity, lack of spirituality, lack of unethical behavior. We need ethical behavior. We need a world embracing vision. There's a lack of true love and fortifications of unity.
Okay, so I heard the word unity and I heard prejudice, and I'll tell you what Baha'u'llah said. I'll leave it to the experts. And I'm stuck again for some reason, not sure why. So I'm gonna unshare really quickly. There we go. So unity is what Baha'u'llah said was the problem of our time. So Baha'u'llah came, his message, his mission was to create unity, because that was and that is the problem of the modern age, and it's the way we will solve the problems that we have, and it's the only way, because we are now a world that is interconnected. And what happens in Japan, if a nuclear reactor melts down in Japan and toxins spill into the ocean, the ocean is continuous. So eventually those toxins are going to reach us. Or if we have fires, I thought it was interesting when we had the fires in Australia, how in New Zealand, they were seeing the smoke. This is the nature of the world that we live in now. And perhaps it was always the nature of the world, but we didn't know about it. And we didn't have the technology back in, hundreds of years ago to do anything about that, to respond effectively to the fact that things happening on one side of the earth could impact those happening on another side of the earth. So the solutions that we have to come up with for these problems require a level of unity and cooperation like never before. So Baha'u'llah puts it so much more, and Abdul Baha, so much more eloquently than I can. So if someone could please read this quote.
Today, the one overriding need is unity and harmony among the beloved of the Lord, for they should have among them but one heart and soul, and should, so far as in them lieth, unitedly withstand the hostility of all the peoples of the world. They must bring to an end the benighted prejudices of all nations and religions, and must make known to every member of the human race that all are the leaves of one branch, the fruits of one bough.
Thank you. So if you look at this quote, he refers to every individual on the face of the earth as belonging to one branch, right? We're all the leaves of one branch, the fruits of one bough. In many other Bahai writings, he refers to us as drops of one ocean, leaves of one tree, flowers of one garden, which I like because it emphasizes the diversity of the human race, all different colors and sizes and shapes, but we are all unified in that diversity in one human garden. I think it's useful also to talk about the benefits of that diversity. When we think about the problems that we have to solve, that expression where, they say two heads are better than one. Well, many heads are better than two. And it's not just the number of heads that matters. It matters the differing perspectives that each person brings to solving that problem. So I think we're used to thinking of this in our work environments, where a lot of times we work on projects as teams. And so everyone's contribution is listened to, and then we come up with a solution. And, one person's perspective or background may give them a different perspective or a different skill and a different way of looking at the problem, and they're able to solve, or to contribute to the solution in a way that another person wasn't. When we don't have unity, when everyone doesn't have the same opportunities to contribute to the discussion, to contribute to solving problems, then it takes a lot longer to solve those problems, and sometimes we don't even reach a solution. And on the next slide, we'll talk about, we'll do a thought experiment where I will kind of get us all to kind of understand that on a deeper level. Let me come here. Okay, so here's the thought experiment. We'll read this quote first, and then I'll give you the thought experiment. Okay, if someone could please read this quote.
The utterance of God is a lamp, whose light is these words: Ye are the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. Deal ye one with another with the utmost love and harmony, with friendliness and fellowship. He who is the day star of truth beareth me witness. So powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth. The one true God, he who knows all things, himself testifies to the truth of these words. Exert yourselves that ye may attain this transcendent and most sublime station, the station that can ensure the protection and security of all mankind. This goal excels every other goal, and this aspiration is the monarch of all aspirations.
Okay, thank you. So just looking at this quote, where it says that so powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth. Where does that power come from? Why is it that unity is so powerful? What is it about unity that makes it so powerful? And I was kind of talking about this a little bit before, where I said that the diversity, the unity and diversity, that diversity is something that gives us strength. I always like to see articles and stories about people all over the world that are doing unique and wonderful things. And it always impacts me, because I also think about all the people who don't really have the opportunity to fulfill their potential because of things like poverty and other, issues. Maybe they're in a war zone. You have all these children all over the world who are growing up in war zones. You have children that are hungry. And I see these children, and I know, because I am a teacher by profession, so maybe that's why I kind of think of it this way. But I know their potential, and I know that so many of them have so many contributions to make, and that they won't get to make those contributions because they're not in a position, they don't have the opportunity to do so. We think of all the problems that we have, and a lot of times we approach it from a material perspective, and we think if we just throw more money at it or more people at it, that will solve the problem. But it's not just the quantity of resources, but it's the quality of those resources. And when those resources aren't diverse, then you're not getting all those different backgrounds and perspectives contributing to the solution. So my own personal interpretation about the power of unity comes from my belief that diversity, or the quality of the contribution, can have a really big impact. So why do we allow our brothers and sisters all over the world to live in conditions that we wouldn't want to live in? I think this brings us back to the problem of racism, and why racism is a why ending racism and establishing and building unity is a prerequisite to solving all the other problems that we talked about. Because all of those problems are complex and require solutions that are going to require a lot of resources and a lot of diversity of thought and a lot of cooperation to solve, because we can't put out a fire in the United States and leave it raging all over the world and not expect it to flare up again. If we want to have lasting solutions to these problems, then they need to be on a global scale. And if that's going to happen, then we need to think of everyone all over the world as one human family, and care as much about people on the other side of the world as we care about our next door neighbors. So when we think of it that way, then we know that we have no choice other than to unify. So let's do a thought experiment at this point. And I'd like to ask you, how do you think the world would be different? But think of a particular problem, because I do want to be specific. It might be hard to imagine how solving racism and building unity in the United States and globally could solve the problem, say, of human trafficking, or solve the problem of climate change, or the impacts, lessen the impacts of climate change, or how it could solve the problem of school shootings, or the opioid addiction, or any number of problems all over the world. So pick a particular problem and think about how building unity could result in a solution to that problem, or could help us solve that problem. So I'll give everybody about 5 minutes to really think about that, or 3 minutes, or however long you need. Think about that, and then please be prepared to share if you'd like. I hope that you would, with everyone, what your thoughts are about that.
So we have a few questions, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I should have paused for questions first, and then we'll do this thought experiment. Thank you, John.
No worries, no worries. The first question we have is from Karen. She asks, how have you seen the reactions of others to the teachings of Baha'u'llah and race unity evolving over the years?
Oh, great question. Well, I'll kind of preface this by saying that I don't know if it was so much other people evolving, or whether it was my evolution and my understanding of the Baha'i faith and my own personal and spiritual growth that allowed me to see more clearly the impact of the Baha'i teachings on people's actions and behaviors, if I'm understanding the question properly. So as a new Baha'i, 20 something years ago, or is it 30 years ago? Oh my goodness. The Baha'i teachings, I believed them, right? And that's why I became a Baha'i, because prior to even knowing anything about the Baha'i faith, I had these ideas in my mind of what the world needed, smart me, right, to solve its problems. But I didn't see that around me, right? I didn't see that reflected in the world around me. And so when I became a Bahai, some of the most prominent things I noticed were that people of all different backgrounds associated with one another freely and openly, and I had never been exposed to this. I'm from Chicago, and I know that people have the image of the South as being very segregated and very racist, right? Or more so than other parts of the country. But Chicago is actually one of the most segregated parts of the country. It's a city that has a reputation for being very segregated. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, which is primarily African American. Actually, I mean, there aren't many places where you would even see a white face when I was growing up. So when I became a Bahai and I went to Bahai meetings and I saw people from all different backgrounds, not just racial backgrounds, but class backgrounds, right? Because one of the unspoken truths of this country is that not only do people not associate with people from other races as much as, a lot, right? But they also don't associate with people from different class backgrounds, right? And they don't associate with people from different religious backgrounds many times. And when I say associate, I don't mean casually. I mean in their intimate, interactions. So people they have to their homes for dinner, right? So when I would attend Bahai meetings, that was something that stood out to me the most, where people from different linguistic backgrounds, I mean, you'd hear prayers and quotes and writings recited in Persian and Spanish and, English and German and French. And it was so refreshing and it was so hopeful. So that was immediate. I did notice that immediately. In terms of people's interpersonal relationships, I can only speak to what I experienced. And so as I grew in the faith and started attending different events, I actually got to meet people from so many different backgrounds. And, my best friend became a white person, which, growing up, that wouldn't have happened, not necessarily because of any levels of prejudice that we may have had, but simply because I wasn't even exposed to them in order to have a relationship with someone from another racial background. So I know that I myself evolved in my own actions and outlook toward race unity. As far as the Baha'i community itself, I've seen that our institutions have encouraged us as individual Baha'is to address this issue, and I've seen Baha'is respond. As I said earlier in my introduction, I really appreciate and value and am hopeful and humbled by the level of activity I see here at the Clearwater Bahai Center, and also with the task force that we created, or I shouldn't say I joined and I'm a part of, but in Tampa we have the Race Unity Task Force, and I've seen this all over the country where so many ad hoc committees and groups and activities are springing up around this issue, led by and inspired by Baha'i teachings. So I have seen that evolve. I hope that answered the question. I think it did. Any other questions?
Yes, there are. So there is a question regarding, this is from Alex Boyson. So there's a question regarding the subject of contributions. He's asking, what are you thinking about when you say, quote, the quality of contributions, in addition to the need for diversity? And he clarifies this is in connection with the two needs you mentioned, diversity and the quality of contributions. And further, also, might you repeat the question you just asked? He was asking about, after you shared the utterance of God is a lamp.
Okay, so I think what you're referring to is when I talked about that for me, the power of diversity comes from the quality of the contributions that people can make to solving problems. I believe that's what you're referring to. So what I mean by that in terms of quality is the differences, right? So if you have a room full of 10-year-old boys, right? 10-year-old boys tend to have similar experiences, right? They're all in a certain grade level. They all have similar, after school activities. They may read the same types of books. Of course, we have individual differences, but in general, a group of 10-year-old boys, right, is going to have a different set of experiences from a group of 55-year-old women, right? So if you have a problem that needs to be addressed, and it's a global problem, like pretty much all of our problems are nowadays, and you have a group of, say, 25-year-old men addressing and trying to solve that problem, you are probably going to have a certain set of solutions, which is limited to the experiences that those people have had in their lives, limited to their skill sets and their experiences. But if you have a group of people trying to address a global problem, and you have an 80-year-old Asian woman and a 25-year-old African-American man and a, 50-year-old Russian woman, the more background, I'm sorry, the more diverse that group of people is, the more experiences they bring to the table. The more different brain types you have, and that of course is an individual thing as well, but certain cultures, right, it may have certain emphasis, like, certain Native American cultures have, quite a few words for snow. And that's just a small example. Some cultures may have certain experiences dealing with, say, climate change that other cultures don't, or how to address crop rotations, or whatever the case might be. So when you have a group of people from many different diverse backgrounds, the quality of that discussion, that consultation to address a problem, is going to necessarily increase, because you're going to have more and diverse responses, more creative responses, say, when that combination of ideas comes together. I hope I answered the question. If not, please type it in the chat.
Well, he says, wonderful, thank you.
Okay. Okay.
So we have this other question as well that was brought up. And let me see. We have another comment. I'll mention the comment quickly. Ed Respes says, the pandemic is one that if we shared global medical research and discussions of treatments and sharing worldly knowledge, it would help if we were more united. That is totally a good point. We should definitely be more united in our efforts.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's a response to the thought experiment. So I did ask for a specific example of how unity could, advance us along toward a solution, whereas a lack of unity kind of causes chaos and people working at cross purposes. Do we have another question, John, before we get to some more of the responses to the thought experiment?
Not at the moment. I think it's best we move to the thought experiment.
Okay, great. So could anyone else contribute? And that's whether you type it or if you want to say it, just unmute yourself and give your response.
Sorry, what was the thought experiment?
Okay, so I'll go back. The thought experiment is to think of a problem that we have either in this country or a global challenge. And think about how unity, particularly unity across, just unity in general, but unity in diversity, could help solve that particular problem. Because it's one thing to talk in generalities, and that can be, I guess, one of my faults sometimes is I look at the big picture, and a lot of times I talk in a very broad way, but I like to get very specific and talk about a specific problem that could be helped or solved, or the solution could be more quickly found if our efforts to solve that problem were more unified, where we had, if the world was more unified, where we thought of one another as brothers and sisters, as opposed to just, isolated countries, how that could facilitate solving the problem.
I think a problem could be poverty.
Okay. In what way would it be more easily solved if we were more unified?
Well, we could really think about a solution that would help, a more just contribution of riches.
I agree with you. And I actually think that sometimes we don't, we're not always the most altruistic people, right? People are people and we are not perfect, right? So we all have our moments of selfishness, or sometimes we're just so fearful or so concerned or so, what's the word? We feel like pessimistic that we can find a solution. So you'll hear people say all the time, there's no way to solve poverty. We're always going to have lots of poor people. You have many people that say that, right? You have people that say, we'll never solve racism. We'll never solve these problems. But just to talk about your example of poverty, some people think that it's okay. And, if we just try to work on poverty within a small context. So let's say we solve, there are countries where the poverty rate is a lot lower than the poverty rate in the United States. And that's great for those countries. But right now you have people immigrating to those countries because they are living in situations of poverty and they don't have economic opportunity. And what's happening in those countries is that many of the citizens are becoming resentful because they've got their nice society that they've struggled and fought to set up, right? And they've got this system that's working really well. And then all these people in need, right, are immigrating to their countries. And that's causing a lot of political and social strife. I'm not here to say that those people are evil or they're bad. But what I can say is that thinking in a narrow way about solving a problem in our own little sphere can come back to bite us, because we may think we have that problem solved and we may actually have it solved for that small area, right? But we cannot isolate ourselves and wall ourselves off from the rest of the world. And as a Bahai and as a religious person in general, I think we can all agree, if you have religious beliefs at all, that our mandate is not to only think of ourselves or only think of our limited environment, that we are supposed to care about our brother, that we are our brother's keeper. And it's not just an altruistic emotion. It's not just because we should, but if we don't, we'll see that whatever solutions we think we've created are not going to be long-lasting solutions. So it's in our best interest, as well as in our spirit, as well as being part of our spiritual development, right? It's also in our best interest, just practically, to address these problems on a global scale.
Right.
So we've got some other comments in the chat as to the experiment.
Yes.
They Alex says, there is power in unity, a power which is absent when there is a lack of communication, conversation, discussion, consultation, which in reality are outcomes of unity. So basically, any problem would benefit from it. So
Thank you.
if unity exists, these things, lack of communication, conversation, discussion, and consultation, those problems will go away. And further, and that's something I actually have to add, that's something that people don't really know about unity. They think unity means if there's a problem, they just bow to it and run away from the problem. And the fact is that unity involves what Alex just mentioned: communication, conversation, discussion, consultation. And it involves certain rules that you have to apply, which involves listening to the other and caring about the truth and not just what you feel over everyone else's feelings. Mm-hmm. The other comment left, it says, another would be a global crop sharing, farming solutions globally, pure water as a standard human right. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Those are all very beautiful. Another one, Alex mentions the Bahai quote from Baha'u'llah: no power can exist except through unity. No welfare and no well-being can be attained except through consultation.
Thank you. And the reason I did ask for these concrete examples is because it's tempting to hear the language used in the writings, which is often very poetic and very flowery. Sometimes it's very direct, but even then it can sometimes be so broad that specific examples aren't given. And many of us need specific examples to really hone in on exactly what that mechanism is, how it is that unity brings about quicker and more effective solutions. So thank you to the person who said every problem can be solved better with unity, because I agree with you, but breaking it down is helpful. Because we actually do have to do this, right? It's not just once we agree, let's say we all agree that unity is the solution, then we have to do it. So one hurdle is just convincing everybody that unity is the solution, right? And then the real work begins of actually putting it in practice. And so then we have to look at, particular problems, all the problems, and see how we can start to solve them. Yes.
We have another comment from Regina.
Mhm.
Regina says, diversity of leadership in cities. For example, the Black mayor of Sacramento has introduced the idea of a minimum subsistence payment to people to address poverty. So having the sensibilities as to empathy towards people's plights that they're going through, and recognizing that there's perchance another way to go about solving the problem.
Thank you. That's such a good example, because I like the word sensibilities, right? So diversity is not just of, we think of diversity on the surface, right? People of different colors, or even, genders, ages. So that is a type of diversity. And when I mentioned those diversities, even though I used words like different race or different gender or different age, I'm actually talking about different sensibilities. So thank you so much, the person who brought that up. And a lot of times, right, our sensibilities, many of them come from our life experiences, which often come from our cultural backgrounds, our genders, our ages, etc. So it's not so much, I'm not saying that because somebody is Black or somebody is white, they automatically have these, different ideas. It has more to do with the fact that, we do live in a world where your race or your age or your gender strongly impacts the types of experiences that you will have, which also impacts your sensibilities, not to negate individual differences. And those sensibilities, like the example that you gave with the mayor of, what was it, San Francisco, I think you said, bringing in that sensibility, right, toward that issue, and coming up with a solution that maybe someone else would not have thought of, or whose cultural background just didn't gear them toward thinking that that was a possible solution. Thank you.
So there's another subject, and I think that this is my contribution. I think it's extremely valuable for unity, and it's something that is from the Bahai writings from Abdul Baha, Principles of Bahai Administration. And this is in the context of Bahai administration, but the points are very clear. As forgiveness is one of the attributes of the merciful one, so also justice is one of the attributes of the Lord. The tent of existence is upheld upon the pillar of justice and not upon forgiveness. The continuance of mankind depends upon justice and not upon forgiveness. So if, at present, the law of pardon were practiced in all countries, in short time the world would be disordered and the foundations of human life would crumble. To recapitulate, the constitution of the communities depends upon justice, not upon forgiveness. So there has to be a certain level of order that when we're going about achieving unity, we need to all be willing to follow, which means, like how we have in this context on the presentation, there are certain amounts of rules of how we engagement, so that the message itself can be clearly made across to anyone who watches this after. So we go through preparation. Monique goes and puts a presentation together, very thoughtful quotes and so on. But if there is that injustice that comes about where things don't go as they were intended in the respect of, say, we talk about unity through consultation and all these things we just mentioned. If you don't have consultation, if the rest of the group doesn't stay quiet for the one who's speaking to be heard, that person is not given the justice that they deserve to be listened to. And likewise, it goes into every aspect of achieving unity. There are there are approaches that we need to take to do justice to those that we're working with. That means we have to listen, but also it goes both ways, that everyone has to listen to one another. Everyone's contribution has to be ultimately heard, so that in their eyes, they feel they're being treated as well with justice, despite whatever their origin may be. We need to recognize that there's justice and there's equity, and more importantly, the goal that we have, which all of these build towards, unity.
Thank you. I'd really love to hear if somebody else has a specific example of a problem that they think could be solved, and how specifically unity would facilitate the resolution of that problem. If there are any more. If not, I'll kind of give some final comments. I don't know if that means no or you're frozen, because I see you as frozen for a moment, John.
Oh, I'm looking right now for in the chat. I see we have something from Steve Zaludek, one of our previous speakers. He says, how do we reconcile the need to create and foster unity with the desire to fight against forces that are creating injustice for our fellow citizens? How do we speak out without becoming political or creating disunity? That's a good question.
That's a good question. Rather than monopolize the answer, I'll see what anyone else has to say. And then if nobody has, I can try and answer it from my perspective.
We have one answer from the audience. Karen Fernanda Pazir says, better infrastructure in poorer communities to enable greater participation. That is a complete yes. If people are not starting with the same infrastructure, you already have that inequity and ultimately that inability to do the same thing. So yes, we need to have better infrastructure. So if especially you're talking about within the same financial structure where taxes are being paid and so forth, and you have one school that's run down and you have one school that's kept very well, if the reason is because the funding isn't there to make the infrastructure work, yeah, that's not good. Of course, there could be a lot of reasons for a lot of things, but if that is the reason, that is definitely something to address.
Mm-hmm. If I understand Steve's question correctly, also, I would say that if we keep in mind that I guess I talked about this already, but I'll just kind of reiterate it. If we're looking at combating racism as fighting against something, right, then the temptation would be to kind of become political and partisan in the way that we address the solutions. Whereas if we're thinking in terms of building unity, that's something that we can do in any context. And we can do it across religious, racial, class, and political lines. In fact, that's the definition, right, of building unity. So I think if we keep that focus on the positive, right, on what really exists, and that's unity, as opposed to, darkness doesn't exist, light does exist. Racism is a manifestation of a lack of unity. So if we focus on building unity, I think we can avoid a lot of the pitfalls that happen when we talk about fighting racism in a different way, that is more, which excludes other people from being part of the solution.
So Alex Boyson wants to give a comment. I'm going to unmute him. You're unmuted, Alex.
Thank you, John, and I forget the speaker's name.
Monique.
Monique, thank you, Monique, as well. Thank you, wonderful. I just wanted to add that perhaps it's easier to look at the world and the greater structures and what's happening in the world, what comes in the news. But at the same time, it occurs to me that what the Baha'is are doing is trying to build it from the grassroots, and that's more invisible. It's about the starting the conversations and getting to know one's neighbor and broaching issues that occur in every location, which are different, of course, according to where one lives. And yes. Just that. Thanks.
Okay.
And if anyone has further comments to leave, just like Alex, feel free to contribute to the conversation. We would appreciate that. Just leave us a message if you want to go about it. We also have another point as to I'm going to call race amity, the unity, the bringing people together. It's that we have so many reasons for uniting ourselves rather than dividing ourselves. And the most valuable of all of it is united we stand and divided we fall. Among the best tactics of people who conquered others, it was to divide and conquer. It was never to unify them and conquer them. No, it was to divide and conquer. We are weakest when we are separated. We are weakest when we are alone and without assistance of others. And for that reason, it's extremely important that everyone in our society recognize the intrinsic value that all of us have to contribute solutions to common problems. And it's not a my problem versus your problem.
Uh-oh, you cut off, John. Your volume is, I'm not hearing you. Oh.
In Holocaust, you had people who were targeted. You had people who were targeted because of who they were, what they said, what they did. Then it increasingly turned into what they believe. And people didn't speak up because it wasn't them. But the fact is that if you allow a society to exist where certain people are mistreated, the opening exists ultimately for yourself to be mistreated, because an exception will be found if it's convenient. So if we don't allow for convenient exceptions as to mistreatment, we really have a system that helps everybody. And if more people realize this, we won't have repeats of these historical atrocities that have occurred, which is not limited to the Holocaust, but of course, America's history of slavery, disenfranchisement, marginalization, and ultimately illegal laws. It's funny to say that, but laws that would come about and restrict the rights of people without a legal basis, let alone those in other countries that have, and in this country as well, that have done stuff legally. So one of the most important benefits that the Baha'is can give is introducing a sense of morality that is not contingent upon the circumstances only. It's timeless. It doesn't matter where we are in history. These rules that we're all equal, that we have to treat people with a sense of equality under the law, these things contribute to that justice. That contributes to that unity, because they're all prerequisites for unity, where people feel safe. And Ed Resquez left a comment. He says, it's because people don't try to get to know each other, and it's the result of being prejudging. It's the result of prejudging someone before we don't know them, and that stops us from becoming genuine friends. Do you see that, Monique, in the comment to everyone?
I'm not able to see. Let me stop share, and then that might help.
On the bottom of your screen, there's an icon that says chat, or the
Yeah,
top.
I see it now. Thank you. Yeah, while I was sharing, it took up my whole screen. Right. So prejudice in terms of getting in the way of getting to know other people. Oh, most definitely. Yeah, I'm just looking at some of the other comments. Okay.
So there's a Bahai hidden word that says that the poor are God's trust in our midst, and he addresses this to the rich ones on earth, and that we should not be intent upon our own ease. All of us, those who have resources, when one doesn't, we should be guarding God's trust, and we again should not be intent solely on our own needs. And it's interesting the language that Baha'u'llah uses towards education. Humans, all of us, men being a mind rich in gems of inestimable value. The fact is that as a society, as we inhibit the means for ourselves to ultimately progress, where so many beautiful contributions to our society are not being made when they're not able to be shown, it's something very, very valuable to recognize that this unity is really a springboard for humanity to prosper like it never has before. It's a springboard for growth and development, and something that we've never seen yet. We've seen glimpses of it though, right, Monique?
Of course, yes. I mean, that the idea that I feel bad when I see the pessimism around me, people's feelings that we can never solve these problems, which is why I kind of try to give the positive definition of ending racism, building unity, because we can do that. That is something I think we all can do on even at the smallest level as individuals, right? We can all reach out to another person and build unity through friendship. And as Ed said, it's up to us to not let our prejudices that we may still have interfere with that process. As a Baha'i, I can tell you one of the other areas in which I've grown and kind of come to a higher level of understanding is in the area of spiritual law, and the idea that spiritual laws are as concrete as I want to say, when we think of a spiritual law, we think of it as something that can't be broken. So if I jump off of the top of a building, it's not like maybe I'll fall, or maybe, it's gonna happen, because we think of spiritual laws as absolute, that they happen all the time and there is no way around them, right? Well, spiritual law is the same way. And I know that intellectually, I don't always act, based on that knowledge. I try to, and I will continue to try to. But just knowing, right, that spiritual law is also as absolute, as, guaranteed to happen as physical laws, for me is a source of inspiration and hope. And I try to communicate that to others. So, if we put kindness out there, if we put unity out there, it will have a fruit. If we sow those seeds, right, we may not be around to see the results of the sowing of those seeds, but it will happen. That harvest will occur. So I do believe, whether it's in my lifetime or, my children's or my grandchildren's or great grandchildren's lifetime, that these efforts will come, to fruition, that there will be a fruit, and Baha'u'llah, those of us who believe in God's promises, whether we're Christian or Muslim or Bahai or whatever religion we happen to be, also have promised, our religions promise us that these solutions will occur, that God's kingdom will be established eventually on earth. But as Baha'is, we believe that we'll build that kingdom, that the way it'll be established, God has given us the bounty of building the kingdom and establishing it ourselves. So that's where my optimism comes from.
That optimism is very valuable, because the fact is that, again, we have to have that. If we want to make a change, we have to be the change we want to see. And sometimes it comes in the very simplest package of simply believing it can be done. And it's something that, sadly, I've had experience with, understanding that people just don't believe. So even if they are amazing people in their lives, they do amazing things, where they lack that belief that they can make that effect, they literally are shooting themselves in the foot, because they are that change already in a lot of ways, but that. And as long as we feel powerless, again, divided, we fall. That's the reason for this unity, that as these bricks come together, they get stronger, not weaker. So Steve left a comment. Did you see his comment?
I did, and I just didn't. So Steve, sorry. I know how you feel. That happens a lot, and it is tempting because of the pessimism that we have sometimes, right? It is tempting to kind of try to deal with these things, or just have a need to vent and deal with these things in a more, kind of forceful way. And all we can do, right, is fall back on our beliefs in the ability of positive solutions to make a change, right? And to continue to build unity as a solution. But I do understand it's not easy. And if, for those of you who maybe don't see the comment, if Steve was just talking about having a Facebook conversation that just was getting very political. And as Baha'is, we don't see politics as the ultimate solution. We all, of course, know that governments and political solutions can have short-term impact and have positive and have a role to play, but the ultimate solutions are not sustainable simply through politics. So I understand where Steve is coming from, and I sympathize with you trying to avoid a political debate, especially in this environment right now. We have an election coming up, and it can be very hard to avoid kind of devolving into these back and forth political discussions, which, however important it is to participate in that process, the electoral process, we know that long-term solutions are only possible through changing hearts and minds. So, and then Alex put a quote, one of the quotes, Baha'i quotes here: "A kindly tongue is the lodestone of the hearts of men. It is the bread of the spirit. It clotheth the words with meaning. It is the fountain of the light of wisdom and understanding." So true. Because if we speak, it doesn't matter what truth we're trying to share. If we don't share it in a way that the hearer can hear us and is willing to listen to us, it really doesn't matter how smart we are or how perfect our solution is or our knowledge is. Whatever we're trying to communicate, if we're not communicating it in a way that that person feels that we actually care about them as a human being and not just to convince them of something, how much are they really going to listen to us?
That's an important question, because if people realize that we have to, engage in certain behaviors that makes people want to speak with you, to address certain subjects, to feel that their time spent with you is going to be productive to achieving the same goal we all have, that's something that is extremely valuable, and it requires again listening and also not just being heard but hearing others.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question from Alex Boyson. He sent it to me privately.
Oh, okay.
He says, Monique asked for some concrete problems we can apply unity on. Might she share some she has heard, some that she has experience about?
So I can tell you that as a Bahai, the community building processes that we engage in are a good example of concrete ways that unity can build solutions to problems. For example, you have a lot of parents that are struggling in this day and age with trying to get their kids to be more conscientious, especially with younger children, maybe teaching them to share, teaching them not to fight, teaching them not to, engage in negative activities. And so many of the Baha'i activities respond to that need, and they're based on the idea that all the children need to participate, whatever their background is, whatever religion they are. And this is not to knock Christianity or any other religion, but because Baha'is are so inclusive in terms of, who participates in our activities, I think they can have a bigger impact. So for example, children's classes and junior youth groups and youth groups that focus on doing service in their own neighborhoods, that bring together children of all backgrounds. So you may have Christian children, Baha'i children, Muslim children, all working together, coming together and meeting weekly or more often for the purpose of learning to implement spiritual principles in their neighborhood environments. I think that's revolutionary. It's one thing to go to your own congregation or your own church or your own area and associate with those people and try to, affect maybe some change there or learn about that. But you're going to have a broader impact if that group is interfaith, right? If that group has people from all different backgrounds. So that unity that I see in neighborhoods where the children are in children's classes together, regardless of their religious backgrounds. The junior youth are in classes and groups together, working on solving problems, on cleaning up the neighborhood, where youth are participating in mentoring those junior youth, and those junior youth are perhaps participating in teaching the children. And then they're going back home and teaching their parents what they've learned, and everybody is cooperating. And now you have neighbors who maybe didn't really interact with one another, right, before, who maybe had different religious backgrounds and assumed that was going to be, or assumed that was a reason why they wouldn't associate with one another on an intimate level. All of a sudden, you have all these people from different backgrounds who now know each other in the neighborhood. Not only do they know each other, but they're seeing each other and socializing with one another more frequently and regularly as part of their participation and their support of their children in these programs. So you have neighborhoods all over the country and all over the world. A good example is India, where the caste system is so entrenched that it would have been unheard of for people from different castes, or particularly the lowest caste, to associate on an intimate level their children and their families with people from other castes. And that's happening in the thousands and hundreds of thousands in India because of the principles of unity and seeing one another as leaves of one tree, drops of one ocean. So that's a very concrete example of how unity can bring people together to solve problems. And in many of these places, they're solving really concrete problems, like the need for drinking water, because that is a crisis all over the world. Maybe not so much in the United States yet, except for Flint, Michigan. but it is a problem all over the world. And in many areas, they're coming together to solve those kinds of problems. Problems with farming and all kinds of other, almost anything that you can think of can be addressed by bringing community members together. And for those of you who may not be familiar, many of the Bahai activities, the core activities that Baha'is participate in, have to do with community building across different, religious, racial, and any other background that you could think of. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you very much. Very enlightening.
So it looks like it did.
Okay.
So we are at a point where it's about almost 12:30, our normal stop time.
Okay.
So if you would be happy to actually close it out, I think it'd be best that you do it today.
Okay. Well, I think I kind of have said almost everything, particularly with the questions. So some of the things that I wanted to conclude with, people's questions actually allowed me to say those things. So if there's one point I would kind of reiterate, is that this idea of ending racism and building unity is something that is a prerequisite to everyone's progress. And that last quote, and I'll share it again really quickly. Whoops. I will hope to share it again really quickly. Here we go. So it says that, so exert yourselves that ye may attain this transcendent and most sublime station, the station that can ensure the protection and security of all mankind. So that station is unity. And he's saying that that is going to secure the protection and security of all mankind. I think it's often the case that when people who don't experience racism, institutionalized racism. So white people in America, say, for example, who want to combat racism, who feel a desire to fight against racism, sometimes that first stage in their development is the idea that they want to help, and they want to help Black people, right? They want to help people of color not experience these horrific repercussions of racism, and that's wonderful. But at the same time, I think sometimes people don't understand that racism is not something that only impacts people of color. It's not something that is only harmful to the victims of racism. It's as harmful to the perpetrators, perhaps not on a physical level, but on a spiritual level, it's as harmful, maybe even more harmful to be the perpetrator, right? Or the ignorer of injustice. And it also, the repercussions in terms of having a kind of a sucky world to live in, right? A world where we're full of, conflict and strife, that impacts everyone. So the idea that we need to build unity is, as Baha'u'llah said, it does ensure the protection and security of all mankind. So it's an imperative for everyone, even for people who maybe aren't as concerned about others. If they're concerned about themselves, they need to know that ending racism and building unity is the only solution to the problems that we face together. So that would be my final kind of statement.
Thank you so much. This is a beautiful gift you've given to the world. Hopefully, people watching this will take this to heart and think of ways that the solutions that are in front of us can be applied in their own lives. And most importantly, all this content that you have here, this is open for everyone. Please feel free to share this in any way you so desire, because this content is for the world, for all of you watching today. And if you want to find more content, please go to www.clearwaterbahais.org, and you can see that we'll have, as they appear, our talks, and most importantly, our YouTube channel, Clearwater Bahais on YouTube. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your Sunday.
You too.